Homage to Catalonia book review. So funny thing, since I first read this book 10 years ago, I've considered it one of my favorite books of all time, which makes it very awkward when I'm always unsure about the pronunciation. Is it homage or homage or... I looked this up on the internet before filming, and apparently the word has multiple pronunciations, all of which are acceptable. Catalonia, Catalonia, I don't know. I'm an American. But at any rate, this is a book which I suspect a lot of people are already familiar with. That is, I suspect this is a book a lot of people know about, but maybe a lot of people haven't read. It's a memoir, it's a memoir of George Orwell's time fighting in the Spanish Civil War. It's famous for a few different reasons. One, it figures prominently in the traditional story of George Orwell. That story being that George Orwell started off his life as a socialist. He went to fight in the Spanish Civil War. He became disillusioned with socialism there, and then he became an ardent anti-communist and ended up writing the books Animal Farm in 1984. That's what I learned in high school, and I don't know, you can share your own experiences with me. I suspect that's what a lot of people learn in high school. It's not entirely correct. I mention that because I think there's a disconnect between the myth and maybe the reality. George Orwell did become disillusioned with communism in the Spanish Civil War. However, he stayed as a socialist. So he was a democratic socialist up until the end of his life, even though he was writing books against Stalinism, like Animal Farm in 1984. He never became like a right-winger. He was always a democratic socialist, even when he was writing those books. The other reason that this book is very popular, very famous, at least in certain circles, for example, when I was young, in my early 20s, I was hanging out with a lot of political activists who were either anarchists or had anarchist sympathies, and this book is very popular with anarchists. Now, George Orwell himself was not an anarchist, but he portrays... The book is popular with anarchists in spite of that because he portrays a very sympathetic view of the anarchist-controlled cities like Barcelona in the Spanish Civil War. And I realize that does sound like an oxymoron, anarchist-controlled cities, but the political history of anarchism is complex. Now, Orwell himself presents himself as a little bit politically unsophisticated in this book, meaning he's with a Trotskyist organization, but he presents this as almost by chance. It just so happened that his connections in Spain were connected with Trotskyists. When I first read this book, I thought maybe he was exaggerating how politically unsophisticated he was in order to have more of an everyman type appeal as a narrator. But I double-checked this on Wikipedia, and Wikipedia seems to support this view, that it was just through the luck of his connections that he fell in with a Trotskyist group. So he was with a Trotskyist group, but he has a sympathetic portrayal of the anarchist-dominated areas. He does have some critiques of the anarchists, and even when he's sympathetic to them, I think he's portraying that as more of... He's sympathetic to the working class revolution, which happens to be anarchist. I mean, he doesn't praise it because of its anarchist ideology per se, but he recognizes a working class revolution when he sees one, and he praises it as a genuine working class revolution. Also, in this book, Orwell details exactly how the anarchists got screwed over by the communists. And so for that reason, this book is still popular with anarchists today. In fact, you can still hear anarchists today citing this book as an example of why anarchists should never trust communists because of what happened to the anarchists in Spain, which Orwell details very exactly in this book. I'll come back to that point later. Speaking of anarchists, this book is also, Noam Chomsky, a famous anarchist, is also a big fan of this book. And Noam Chomsky mentions this book as an example of political censorship in the West. So if you're at all familiar with Noam Chomsky and his work, especially during the old mainstream media days before the internet, Noam Chomsky often made the point that, yes, so the Soviet Union has their totalitarian restriction on the freedom of the press, but he said in the West we also have restrictions on the press as well. It just doesn't come from the government, it often comes from corporations, which may be influenced by the government. This is one of Noam Chomsky's favorite examples because it was published, but it was a politically unpopular book at the time it was published because it was very critical of the Communist Party. And in the late 1930s, the Communist Party did have some institutional power or a lot of influence. The Communist Party was at the height of its influence in Britain and America. And also it was portraying the Soviet Union as the villain, which was not popular during the war when we were allied with the Soviet Union. So only a few copies were published in 1938 in Britain, and then it went out in print, and it was never even published in the US at the time. It came back later in the 1950s when again it was popular to be anti-communist after Orwell had died. When it came back as an anti-communist book during the Red Scare. But yeah, Chomsky cites this book as an example of the type of, according to him, type of censorship that existed in Western countries, even though we like to think this is something that only happens in the Soviet Union. So, I've gone through all the political implications of this book and why people who are interested in politics and people who are interested in political history tend to be drawn to this book. And I must confess that's one of the main reasons I picked it up myself. Having said all that, one of the interesting things that struck me upon opening this book and beginning to read it was how wonderfully it was written. And I think that deserves to be emphasized because too often I think people talk about the politics of this book and don't talk about the writing style. And it's so easy to forget that Orwell was a writer first and a polemicist second. I mean, Orwell could just write very readable, very wonderful prose that put you, had the feeling of putting you right there in the scene as you're reading it. And here Orwell is as a first-hand witness to the Civil War in Spain. I mean, he's at a very important historical period and he's creating these very vivid literary pictures of what it's like to be there in that place. And I think maybe it's a pity that that gets overlooked when people are talking about this book. I should have anticipated it, right? Because Orwell's such a wonderful writer. But I got so hung up with the political ideas that this book was supposed to be about that when I opened it and started reading it and I thought, wow, this is really well written. This is such a pleasure to read. And I wonder how many people don't read this book because they think it's just going to be a political manifesto. When actually it's just such a very well written memoir. And to illustrate that, I'll quote from a few parts. The first is the very beginning of the book. So right from the beginning of the book, you know you're in the hands of a writer who knows how to create a scene. So this is the very opening lines of the book. In the linen barracks in Barcelona, the day before I joined the militia, I saw an Italian militiaman standing in front of the officer's table. He was a tough-looking youth of 25 or 6 with reddish-yellow hair and powerful shoulders. His peaked leather cap was pulled fiercely over one eye. He was standing in profile to me, his chin on his breast, gazing with a puzzled frown at a map which one of the officers had opened on the table. Something on his face deeply moved me. It was the face of a man who would commit murder and throw away his life for a friend. The kind of face you would expect in an anarchist, though likely as not he was a communist. There were both candor and ferocity in it. Also the pathetic reverence that illiterate people have for their supposed superiors. Obviously, he could make He could not make heads or tail of the map. Obviously, he regarded map reading as a stupendous intellectual feat. I hardly know why, but I have seldom seen anyone, any man I mean, to whom I have taken such an immediate liking. While they were standing round the table, some remark brought it out that I was a foreigner. The Italian raised his head and said quickly, "Italiano?" I answered in my bad Spanish, "No, Inglés. ¿Y tú?" "Italiano." As we went out, he stepped across the room and gripped my hand very hard. Queer, the affection you can feel for a stranger. It was as though his spirit and mine had momentarily succeeded in bridging the gulf of language and tradition and meeting in utter intimacy. I hoped he liked me as well as I liked him, but I also knew that to retain my impression of him, I must not see him again, and needless to say, I never did see him again. One was always making contacts of that kind in Spain. So that's right from the opening part of the book. And as soon as I read that, I knew I was in the hands of a great writer who was going to make an enjoyable memoir. And these wonderful descriptive passages are all throughout the book. Now, I'm tempted in making this review to just quote one wonderful passage after another, to just kind of say, oh, isn't this description great? Isn't this description great? Isn't this description great? But you have to pick and choose in a review. You can't quote the whole book. So I was thinking about which other passages I would quote at length here, because I figure you can only do one long extended quotation. There's a lot to choose from. There's a very interesting passage in which Orwell gives a very detailed account of what it's like to be shot in a war and to think you're about to die. So again, this is another detail that many people know from Orwell's biography, is he was famously wounded in Spain, quite seriously wounded. And he describes that in his book, and I'm quoting from memory here, but he says something to the effect of, you know, not a lot of people get shot, and so I suspect people might be curious as to what the sensation is like, so I might as well give a detailed description here of what it was like to be shot in the war. And then he goes on to give a detailed description of exactly what one feels or what one senses when one gets shot. I'm not going to quote that exact passage here because I've got another one I'd like to quote, but somebody has put it up on their website, and I'll give a link down below if you want to just read that excerpt. There's also vivid descriptions of the street fighting in Barcelona. There's a scene in which Orwell's wife warns him that the communist police are looking for him, which has a lot of dramatic tension. But I'm not going to quote any of those. I'm going to quote a passage here about what it was like fighting in the trench warfare in Spain, because I think this, I like this passage. So, and I think this passage gives a good sense of the pleasures you get from reading this book. So here is one more extended quotation. This is talking about the trench warfare in Spain. Quote, "There seemed no hope of any real fighting. When we left Monte Pesaro, I had counted my cartridges and found that in nearly 3 weeks I had fired just 3 shots at the enemy. They say it takes 1,000 bullets to kill a man, and at this rate, it would be 20 years before I killed my first fascist. At Monte Oscuro, the lines were closer and one fired oftener, but I am reasonably certain that I never hit anyone. As a matter of fact, on this front and at this period of the war, the real weapon was not the rifle, but the megaphone. Being unable to kill your enemy, you shouted at him instead. This method of warfare is so extraordinary that it needs explaining. Wherever the lines were within hailing distance of one another, there was always a good deal of shouting from trench to trench. From ourselves, fascistas, Marianos, from the fascists, Viva España! Viva Franco, or when they knew that there were English opposite them, go home, you English, we don't want foreigners here. On the government side, in the party militias, the shouting of propaganda to undermine the enemy morale had been developed into a regular technique. In every suitable position, men, usually machine gunners, were told off for shouting duty and provided with megaphones. Generally, they shouted a set piece, full of revolutionary sentiments which explained to the fascist soldiers that they were merely hirelings of international capitalism, that they were fighting against their own class, etc., and urged them to come over to our side. This was repeated over and over by relays of men. Sometimes it continued almost the whole night. There is very little doubt that it had its effect. Everyone agreed that the trickle of fascist deserters was partly caused by it. If one comes to think of it, when some poor devil of a sentry, very likely a socialist or anarchist trade union member who has been conscripted against his will, is freezing at his post, the slogan, "Don't fight against your own class," ringing again and again through the darkness, is bound to make an impression on him. It might just make the difference between deserting and not deserting. Of course, such a proceeding does not fit in with the English conception of war. I admit, I was amazed and scandalized when I first saw it done. The idea of trying to convert your enemy instead of shooting him. I now think that from any point of view, it was a legitimate maneuver. In ordinary trench warfare, when there is no artillery, it is extremely difficult to inflict casualties on the enemy without receiving an equal number yourself. If you can immobilize a certain number of men by making them desert, so much the better. The deserters are actually more useful to you than corpses because they can give information. But at the beginning, it dismayed all of us. It made us feel that the Spaniards were not taking this war of theirs sufficiently seriously. The man who did the shouting at the PSUC post down on our right was an artist at his job. Sometimes, instead of shouting revolutionary slogans, he simply told the fascists how much better we were fed than they were. His account of the government rations was apt to be a little imaginative. Buttered toast. You could hear his voice echoing across the lonely valley. We're just sitting down to buttered toasts over here. Lovely slices of buttered toasts. I do not doubt that, like the rest of us, he had not seen butter for weeks or months past. But in the icy night, the news of buttered toast probably set many a fascist's mouth watering. It even made mine water, though I knew he was lying. So, apologies for the bad reading and the bad Spanish and everything from that quote, but hopefully it gives a flavor of the book. You'll notice maybe in that quote I just read that it's very wonderful in its description, and there's also a certain ironic humor sneaking in there. And that's very typical of the way this book is written. I mean, it's a serious subject, but it's told in a slightly ironical, maybe slightly humorous way. So, as I was reading this book, I was constantly half smiling to myself during a lot of these passages. Now, we're going to come back to the politics. I mean, even though all that being said, I don't want anyone to get the impression that you should only read this book because of the politics, but politics are a part of it. So, coming back to the politics, Orwell himself is almost apologetic when politics intrude into this book. For example, before beginning a political chapter in this book, he says, if you're not interested in the horrors of party politics, please skip this chapter. I am trying to keep the political parts of this narrative in separate chapters for precisely that purpose. At the same time, it would be quite impossible to write about the Spanish War from a purely military angle. It was above all things a political war. Coming to the politics, when Orwell first arrives in Barcelona, he sees that the anarchists are in complete control of the city. And he describes a kind of revolutionary society that the anarchists have created. It's a very interesting description, so I'm going to quote it at length again. Quote, "The anarchists were still in virtual control of Catalonia, and the revolution was still in full swing. It was the first time that I had ever been in a town where the working class was in the saddle. Practically every building of any size had been seized by the workers and was draped with red flags or with the red and black flag of the anarchists. Every wall was scrawled with the hammer and sickle and with the initials of the revolutionary parties. Almost every church had been gutted and its images burnt. Churches here and there were being systematically demolished by gangs of workmen. Every shop and cafe had an inscription saying that it had been collectivized. Even the bootblacks had been collectivized, and their boxes painted red and black. Waiters and shop walkers looked you in the face and treated you as an equal. Servile and even ceremonial forms of speech had temporarily disappeared. Nobody said Senor or Don or even Usted. Everyone called everyone else comrade and thou, and said salud instead of buenos dias. Tipping was forbidden by law. Almost my first experience was receiving a lecture from a hotel manager for trying to tip a lift boy. There were no private motor cars, they had all been commandeered, and all the trams and taxis and much of the transport were painted black and red. The revolutionary posters were everywhere, flaming down from the walls in clean reds and blues that made the few remaining advertisements look like daubs of mud. Down the Ramblas, the wide central artery of the town, where crowds of people streamed constantly to and fro, the loudspeakers were bellowing revolutionary songs all day and far into the night. It was the aspect of the crowds that was the queerest thing of all. In outward appearance, it was a town in which the wealthy classes had practically ceased to exist. Except for a small number of women and foreigners, there were no well-dressed people at all. Practically everyone wore rough working-class clothes or blue overalls or some variant of the militia uniform. All this was queer and moving. There was much in it that I did not understand. In some ways, I did not even like it, but I recognized it immediately as a state of affairs worth fighting for. So, Orwell enlists in the anti-fascist cause, but he soon discovers that there are deep divisions within the anti-fascist side. So this is what makes the Spanish Civil War so complicated, is that there were a lot of divisions on the anti-fascist side. So there's the fascists and then there's the anti-fascists. And on the anti-fascists, on the one hand, there's the anarchists who are setting off a working class revolution, much like Orwell described in the previous excerpt. But also on the anti-fascist side are middle-class bourgeois Republicans who want to establish some sort of capitalist republic. So these two sides are in an uneasy alliance. They're both against the fascists, but the capitalists just want to defeat the fascists and then they want to roll back the gains that had been made by the anarchist revolution. So this is a little bit complicated here, but so far maybe it's still easy to follow. There's the capitalists and the anarchists, and they're both allied together against the fascists. Now here's where things get complicated, or at least counterintuitive. And this is what Orwell claimed that very few people outside of Spain understood. The communists were allied with the capitalists and were against the working class. Now that's strange because that's not what the Communist Party should be doing. But Orwell says that at this point, the Communist Party was completely controlled by Comintern. Comintern being the Communist International, which was completely controlled by Moscow. And Moscow at this point was not interested in a worldwide working class revolution. Moscow only wanted to cultivate the international alliances which would be useful in securing the security, the international security of Moscow itself. So Moscow did not want to upset its alliances with France. And France did not want a working class anarchist revolution on its doorstep. So the Communist Party in Spain was actually working to put down the working class revolution and support the bourgeois capitalists. And so as soon as they got control of the police, the communist-controlled police started putting the anarchists and working class revolutionaries in jail. And Orwell was in Barcelona when this all broke out, when the fighting between the communist-controlled police and the anarchists broke out. And he describes what he saw in vivid detail. Now, Orwell himself was a member of a Trotskyist organization, and Trotskyists were also in trouble when the Moscow-controlled police got control of Barcelona. So Orwell also had to flee for his life from Spain after he saw many of his friends rounded up and jailed. Now, the Communist Party, of course, placed all the blame for the violence on the anarchists and Trotskyists. And the communist newspapers in Britain repeated the official line. And even the capitalist newspapers attacked the anarchists. Orwell writes, quote, "The reason why a one-sided version has been widely accepted is simply that the Spanish revolutionary parties have no footing in the foreign press. In the English press in particular, you would have to search for a long time before finding any favorable reference at any period of the war to the Spanish anarchists. They have been systematically denigrated, and as I know by my own experience, it is almost impossible to get anyone to print anything in their defense." Orwell then dedicates a whole chapter to examining the lies and misrepresentations of the English press, which at this point was partly controlled by the Communist Party. Now, although Orwell apologizes for the political chapter in this book, in my opinion, it was the most interesting. Now, I'm a bit of a political junkie, so take my opinion with a grain of salt. But he does such a good job of demolishing the arguments. Orwell showed that the journalists who were writing about the Spanish Civil War write so many logical absurdities and self-contradictions that even though they were hundreds of miles away from the actual event, they must have known they were lying. And he just demolishes their arguments so beautifully. It's seeing a polemist at his finest work. It reminds me of Noam Chomsky when Noam Chomsky's on his best form. I mean, it's no wonder this is one of Chomsky's favorite books. So as you're reading this book, there's a feeling of outrage, like, ugh, those liars. Can't believe they lied so much. And then you're like, well, at least Orwell gave it to them. You know, he demolished them and shamed them and showed that they were lying. And then you're like, but this book was suppressed when it was first written. It was never published in the United States, only a handful of copies in Britain. So they didn't get the public shaming that they probably deserved at the hands of Orwell. I mean, maybe when this book was republished in 1950, people who were still alive, I guess they got it then. But it's a pity that this book was suppressed at the time because, you know, based on what Orwell writes, it sounds like these people really deserve to be shamed for the lies that they were telling in the press. In particular, Orwell goes after the communist-controlled press, which again in the late 1930s had a certain mainstream legitimacy in Britain. Finally, one can see in these chapters Orwell's frustration with the way politically minded people manipulate the truth. And this, of course, is the theme that he would develop further in 1984. So all